This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning, everyone. The ICF Training and Technical Assistance team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I am Taylor Bilbrey with ICF, and I will be hosting today's session. Today's session is part of our community workshop series and is focused on the monitoring process. It is my privilege to introduce today's first presenter, Chris Andrews. Take it away, Chris.
Thank you, Taylor. Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I know talking about monitoring can be a bit of a dry topic, but I think our goal today is to really dig through what is the monitoring process, what are the considerations to be looking at from eligibility, and most importantly, we have a relatively small group today. And so I want to make sure that we're holding time to answer your questions, talk through scenarios, issues that you all are facing. We know a lot of you are beginning or thinking about your monitoring that you'll be doing. And we want to make sure that we are available to talk through the questions that you all have on that. Two primary objectives. Want to both talk through what are the requirements, but also what are some of the best practices? What are some of the approaches that you can take when you are monitoring your CV service providers and subrecipients, and then really do a deep dive into some of the eligibility requirements, but also what are the documentation standards? What do you need to make sure that you are holding in your client files, in your project files for your different CV activities? As Taylor said, my name is Chris Andrews. I'm with MDG Associates, a subcontractor to ICF, and am joined today with Erica Snyder. Erica, if you want to say hello.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Erica Snyder, coming to you from very hot Carlsbad, California, just outside San Diego. It's, well, okay, we haven't hit 80 yet, so it's a good morning. But for those who are struggling without AC like me, I see you. I feel hot like you. We're going to get through this together.
Thank you, Erica. And I think before starting, just want to get a sense of you all on where you are in your monitoring process. If we can open up poll number 1. And have you monitored your ESG CV subrecipients or providers? Go ahead and submit your answer. We'll give everyone just a couple of minutes to respond. And
Chris, there's a question of which one you want folks to select if they're in progress for monitoring.
Oh, go ahead and select yes if you were going to actively monitoring. It's a great clarification. And as you're doing that, as folks are coming on, as you do have questions, Taylor mentioned this at the top, but as you do have questions, please go ahead, put them into the chat. Both Erica and I will be monitoring the chat and answering your questions as they come in. And then we're holding a lot of time at the end to be able to dive into some of your bigger or more complex questions that you all have.
Great. I think we're ready to close the poll, Chris.
Great. So it looks like a bit more than half of you are either actively monitoring or you have gone through some monitoring exercises, and then another quarter, or you haven't done it yet, but you have a schedule or you have a plan of how you're going to go about doing that. For those of you who have monitored, would love for you to type in some of your lessons learned, maybe what was kind of the one best practice that you would hang on to, what was something that you would do differently, just to share with your colleagues who are on the line, who have a monitoring scheduled, or who haven't yet scheduled that monitoring, but have it on their to-do list and know it's something that they need to be doing. I want to just start kind of in looking kind of at everyone's snapshot of your agreement. That all of HCD's grantees are required to monitor and to report on the performance of their programs. And so this is, subrecipients, you shall be monitoring, all of your activities that you are selected and awarded to ensure compliance with ESG and other federal requirements. And that is your responsibility, to make sure that those service providers, those programs, those activities are being carried out in accordance with the CV rules, with Formula ESG, Part 576, and kind of as appropriate other cross-cutting and financial requirements. So in thinking about monitoring, I think it's kind of a helpful place to start kind of at a pretty high level, and the roles and responsibilities of kind of how monitoring flows, and then how the reporting cycle works. So, if we're to think about, monitoring starts, and I'm going to start at the bottom of the chart, starts at the subrecipients, kind of looking at, okay, what are our service providers doing? What is our rapid rehousing provider doing? What is our shelter? What's our street outreach group? What are they doing? How are they doing it? Are they doing it in compliance? And that then moves up, to making sure that all of your subrecipients, are carrying out their activity, in a compliant manner. And then at a California level, overseeing all of the ESG CV grantees, all of the ESG CV awardees, all the CSCs that have received funding, and making sure, that monitoring and oversight, is done in accordance with all of the rules, all of the requirements that the state has set. And then finally, that's HUD kind of coming and looking at the state program and saying, okay, state of California, CHCD, have you been carrying out the ESG CV program in compliance with ESG CV regs, 2 CFR 200, other cross-cutting, Part 576, now all of the different requirements that we need to look at. And it becomes an opportunity of reporting up, not just of saying, look, these are, where there are flags or issues, but also an opportunity of how can your programs be improved and be made better. I think I do a lot of monitoring with various kind of communities, states, kind of subrecipients. And I always see the opportunity of monitoring is it's not a gotcha moment. It's not a, oh, you did this wrong. It is a, look, you're doing it this way. It may be easier for you. If you do it this way, you may be able to collect data in a different way. Your files could be organized in this fashion to make sure that you are telling your story. And I think a lot of it is then that you're getting credit for what you do. You all, have a set of subrecipients and providers who are doing amazing, amazing work for the members of your community. And you want to make sure that, they're showing what they're doing and they're documenting what they're doing, getting credit, and that you're able to continue to operate your program in an efficient, effective manner to make sure that as you go forward, you can add more programs, you can add more activities, and you can kind of scale up, as different opportunities arise. So I think a lot of people feel pressure, of monitoring from any entity of, oh my gosh, I'm going to be flagged, but it is really an opportunity of how do you, find ways to make your program better, more efficient, more effective, and are there lessons? I'm seeing a lot of chat bubbles pop up. I'm not looking at them, but I'm hoping that those are folks who are going to share in some of your lessons learned, some of your best practices, and monitoring is much the same of, of sharing your best practices, your lessons learned of how we can make our programs better. I think the final piece I want to say on that is I think we also think of monitoring of it being, one entity versus or against another entity. Everybody, kind of from the top, from HUD, kind of down to the subrecipients and service providers, we are all on the same team with the same goals, right? We want to, provide housing, provide services for those people who are in need in our communities. And I think we're all working towards that same goal. So I think it's easy to feel in a monitoring of, oh, it's them coming to flag us, to get us, but it really is everybody working together of how to make sure programs can be operating in their best fashion. Want to give you all just a sense of where we're headed in the monitoring portion of this presentation. We're going to walk through the kind of 6 different stages of monitoring, beginning with risk assessment. It sounds like maybe at least 75% of you who have already started monitoring or have a monitoring plan, you've already gone through this in some fashion, maybe in a formal fashion, maybe in an informal fashion, into developing the monitoring plan. What is your approach to monitoring? Doing all of the prep work, the engagement, scheduling, coordination, the monitoring field work. This is the actual monitoring process, right? Where you're digging into files, looking at documentation, looking at standards, seeing what's there, and then finalizing the monitoring report, and then the monitoring response, the back and forth that you may have with your provider and making sure that they are adjusting their program into a compliant manner. From an outcome perspective, what comes out of a monitoring, right? There's 3 general outcomes. Number 1, I think what we all want to look for, but is not always the case, is a clearance where there haven't been violations of the program or the standard agreement requirements. And I think it's an important place just to stay on right there. It's going to emphasizing standard agreement requirements because not only do you want to make sure that your activities and what you're monitoring on are in accordance with all of the HUD regulations, you also want to make sure that you're checking it against your standard agreement, either that's being set by CAHCD, or if you have more stringent requirements that you're putting at a local level, because those override the requirements of 576 if they're more stringent. The second outcome is a concern, not necessarily a violation of program regs or standard agreement requirements at this moment, but something that, if not corrected, it may turn into a violation, a yellow flag or a warning flag. And then finally, a finding, a violation of the program requirements or the standard agreement requirements, and something that should come with a corrective action of this was an issue, the files should have been kept in this manner, this should have been documented in this way, and it wasn't. Here's how you can go ahead and fix that and correct that finding, potentially retroactively, potentially going forward, potentially a combination of the both, to make sure that your program is operating in a smooth manner going forward. So let's begin with the risk assessment. And the first part of the risk assessment is determining your pool. Who are the providers, who are the entities that you are going to be monitoring, and kind of establishing the time frame of when you're going to be initiating that pool. Is that folks who've had an agreement with you that's more than 3 months old, that's more than 6 months old? Is it folks who have started kind of their activity of drawing down funds? Kind of, you get to determine what that pool of providers is that you will be monitoring. And then the purpose of that risk assessment, is to understand, what is the level of risk, that each entity has. This is a sample risk assessment from HCD, that they're using for their CV program for all of their grantees. But conducting that assessment lets you kind of rate and prioritize. This service provider may have a greater risk. They may have a bigger budget. They may be a new subrecipient. They may be doing a new activity that hasn't been done before. And however you are determining kind of what your assessment and how you're determining risk, it's something that you have control over. You can be evaluating all of your providers to then say, okay, we've done our risk assessment at this point in time in fall of 2022. We are only able to monitor 3 providers, and then we're going to monitor another 3 in the winter. You can prioritize who are those top 3 that you want to monitor by a risk assessment. And doing that risk assessment is really, really helpful if someone pushes back and says, well, wait a second, why are you monitoring us? Are you picking on us? Are you just choosing us for no reason? Why aren't you monitoring this other provider? You can say, well, we conducted this analysis. This is why we chose to monitor this set of providers first, and then might be monitoring that second tranche later in the year. As you go through that assessment for each provider, for each entity, you'd then be entering their relevant data into some sort of risk assessment tracker. Again, this may, depending on the number of providers you have, it may be a little more formal, it may be a little less formal, but you are able to use that tracker to rank all of your subrecipients, all of your service providers from highest to lowest risk, and then determine, okay, here is who we are going to be monitoring first, or here's how we're making our monitoring decisions. Something you're going to hear over and over from me, and I think probably from Erica too, is a big part of today's conversation is documentation, 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 right? Monitoring is such an exercise. Eligibility is such an exercise in making sure that you're keeping that file complete and current so that you can tell your story, right? There is, in all likelihood, the chance that HUD or HCD will come out and monitor in a couple of years and say, well, can you show us how you selected, these subrecipients to monitor? Or can you show us kind of what your documentation standards were kind of within that program? And you just want to make sure you're documenting all of your decisions and you're holding all of that in your program files. So you're not left trying to remember, well, what did we do back in fall of 22 when we were going through our monitoring prep? You just want to document, document, document. So once you get through your risk assessment, your next task is to develop your monitoring plan. Your monitoring plan is exactly what it sounds like. It is your strategy, it's your approach of how you are actually going to be going about monitoring, what your timeline is, what the type of monitoring that you're going to be doing, who the high, who the low kind of risk subrecipients are. And so, are there some happening in the fall or there's some happening in the winter? Having that plan developed. And again, so it can be something that you can easily follow and share and show with others of, well, this is what our monitoring schedule, what our monitoring strategy looks like over the next year, 6 months, whatever your time frame may be. As you're finalizing that plan, you may choose to do 2 different types of monitoring. You can do a desk monitoring, which tends to be kind of an in-depth financial review of one reimbursement request, where you're ensuring that appropriate documentation is being maintained, collecting more documentation than you may normally in that reimbursement request. Alternatively, an on-site monitoring. On-site monitorings right now, they may be done remotely. They may be done in person. I think more often than not, across the country, they're all happening remotely. But the on-site monitoring is a more comprehensive deep dive where you're looking at programmatic files, you're looking at eligibility, you're looking at reporting, you're looking at cross-cutting requirements. Is there compliance with lead-based paint? Is there compliance with fair housing, environmental reviews? Kind of really doing a deep dive into that program or that activity, as well as the financial review. And so making that determination of what type of monitoring you're doing should be part of your monitoring plan. Now, once you move forward, kind of from establishing your monitoring plan into your monitoring preparation, is determining what checklists will you be using. I think the default that a lot of folks use is they use the HUD checklist, which are all in CPD Monitoring Handbook 65092, and where you can pull the relevant ESG, ESG-CV monitoring exhibits. But you may also be using a different set of checklists. You may have your own checklists. You may have a combination of HUD and local checklists that you use. And that is okay. You don't need to use the HUD checklist, but I think you should know that the HUD checklists are summarizing all of the requirements that are necessary for program compliance. So if you are using something else, it's helpful to fact check those or cross-reference those against the CPD monitoring handbook. And so jumping to poll number 2, if we could pull that up. If you are monitoring or if you have monitored already, are you planning to use the HUD monitoring checklist? Yes or no, or if you haven't made any plans yet, you're not sure if you're going to be using the HUD checklists or you'll be using something else. And if we could pull that poll.
Chris, I'm sorry, the polls have disappeared from my screen. So I don't know if someone else has access to the polls there. I'm sorry. Oh, they're back. Let me get it.
And while we're waiting for folks to respond, I just wanted to make sure people saw I put a link to the CPD monitoring handbook in the chat. And so if you aren't familiar with that website Chris shared, you have access to it there.
Great, thank you, Erica. And again, for folks who hopped in late, please put in any questions that you all have into the chat, and we will be holding plenty of time towards the end of our session to dive into questions that you all have.
Chris, I think we're ready to close the poll.
Great. Great, looks like about 2/3 of you all are planning to use or have already used the HUD monitoring checklist. A couple of you are not, and you're using different checklists. And then about 1/3 of you are not sure. And I think I would recommend for those of you who are not sure, it may be helpful to go through the HUD monitoring checklist to look through all of those different exhibits, especially now. Earlier this summer, I think HUD put out a ESG CV addendum that includes ESG CV specific questions that include things about DOB and COVID tieback and some of the additional programs and activities that are allowed under ESG CV that aren't allowed under the formula program. And so I think that can be a helpful guide for you on what you're using. And you may say, great, we only need these 15 questions, and we don't need to confuse our service providers with sending a 15-page checklist when we can condense the HUD one down to 5 pages or 6 pages. And that can be a great approach, you know, for those of you who aren't sure. Kind of moving into monitoring preparation, you know, is establishing a monitoring strategy. And I think, again, these are the strategies and the document request checklist that HCD is using kind of within their monitoring. But developing, okay, here's the type of monitoring that we're going to be doing. Here's the subrecipient, you know, contact information, timeline of the monitoring, what's being collected, what programs being looked at, and then having a document request checklist. I think the common monitoring strategy is to send out kind of whatever checklist you're using. So folks, you know, monitoring is an open book exam, right? You get to see every question that you're being asked, but it's also really helpful to give people a study guide and say, look, you probably want to be looking at these different documents because this is what we're going to be wanting to see, you know, to know where the materials are coming from. And so having a document request checklist for, you know, each of the program types or financial or programmatic, whatever type of monitoring you're doing, is very, very helpful. From there, you know, wanting to start to assemble your records, kind of building out what is your file structure, right? We're going to say documentation, documentation, documentation. And it is important to kind of build out that documentation and have tools, you know, here's the file checklist, here are all the records we're looking at, here's the timeline, here's the approach of monitoring, built out in advance of that monitoring, and having that done before you send your intent to monitor letter. You know, and this is, you know, generally sending out 30 days before the monitoring event, and detailing when the monitoring will occur, if it's remote or it's on site, where and how if it is being done remotely, where and how documents can be uploaded, what are the activities and areas and timeframes that are being reviewed, what are the monitoring checklists that you're using, right? Again, it's an open book test, and then providing that document request checklist so folks can see, okay, you are going to be looking at, you know, ABC or XYZ. And then putting out that letter that you are making, you know, the actual intent or the notice of the actual intent to monitor, that you are sending that. And so you're able to document and have a paper trail and a record of saying, okay, as of 9/8/2022, we sent out these monitoring letters to these subrecipients. This is the monitoring activity that is taking place. And then finally, you know, preparing an entrance conference to talk through what will happen and what are all the monitoring activities that will be occurring and what you're looking at. Ideally, you're reviewing some of your own programmatic records before you're getting all the records from the subrecipient. You're looking at the agreement, you're looking at their performance reports that have been submitted, any reimbursement requests that have been made, if they provided copies of their written standards or their policies and procedures as part of their application. You want to make sure that your monitors know those programs as well as they can, kind of leading up into that monitoring, leading up into that entrance conference to kick off the actual monitoring process. And then again, having, hosting that entrance conference, everything from, if you're doing it in person, structure of the space, what your timeline is, where and who you'll be coordinating with, to get additional documentation if you do it. If you're doing it remotely, it's still a really helpful conversation to have, just so folks know exactly kind of what process you're going to be doing and how you're going to be doing it, and when you anticipate to be following up with questions or requests for more detail or more documentation, if you're going to be doing it as it comes up, if you're going to be doing it, at the end of the week, different ways you can do it, but to be hosting that entrance conference. And that conference is what kicks off the actual monitoring fieldwork, right? When you think about monitoring, it is the monitoring fieldwork and the process of actually performing the monitoring review. And so here, depending on what checklist you're using, if you're using a HUD checklist, if you're using a different checklist, you want to be going through that checklist and answering yes, no, or not applicable. And then providing a written justification, ideally referencing the source documentation that you use to make that determination, right? It's not a very helpful monitoring if you're just saying, oh, yes, they complied with this. No, they didn't. Yes, they did. No, they didn't. Without saying, yes, they complied. They have this written standard. It was on page 15 of X document. And making sure that you have all of that information, especially if you are identifying a concern or a finding or an issue, you want to be able to point to, look, this is exactly where we're seeing the issues. So you can make it clear to your provider, where the gap may be, where the issue may be. So they're both aware of the error, but also so you have a place to begin of how do you work to make it better? How do you address that issue? Once you are through the monitoring review, you conduct an exit conference. And this is an opportunity to be sharing preliminary findings and concerns. And in those sharings, it's an opportunity to get feedback from the subrecipient, from your provider. Was there a missing document? Was there a misunderstanding of what you are interpreting? Did they have other materials that they could provide that address that finding or concern? And it also then, if there are findings that can't be resolved through additional documentation or detail, an opportunity to share, this is what might be some, the corrective action, just so folks are aware of what's coming. I think, again, back to what I said at the top of the presentation, we are all in this together, right? It's not, one side versus another, even in monitoring. So it's working together and giving that preview to say, this is what we need to do. Here's what we can provide you. Here's how we can help you and to make that corrective action so your program is the better for it. And then again, I feel, a little bit, Brady Bunch-esque, but documentation, making sure that you have all of the materials that you've reviewed, all the source documentation, that you are flagging that kind of within your, monitoring checklists, and you're holding all that documentation so that if you need to pull up your monitoring report in a year or in 2 years, you're able to show, look, here's our monitoring report and here's everything that we use to make those decisions. Okay, moving into the home stretch. Once you're done with your monitoring fieldwork, you prepare your monitoring report. This is the written summary of the monitoring. When did you do it? What did you look at? Were there findings? Were there concerns? Were there other observations? And I think other observations is also an opportunity to say, look, you were doing this really well. Can you build off of this strength that you have in your program, in your grants management, in your financial management, and connect that to other activities? Right, the monitoring doesn't only need to be focused on the negative. You can be making observations that are positive as well. Your draft monitoring report should also be identifying what corrective actions are needed, and then what is the timeline for response. Prior to issuing the monitoring report, always recommend that you have someone else in your team review it, and make sure that everything is clear. Make sure that your findings and concerns are tied to data that you can point to, and that the corrective action is a measurable and a documentable kind of action that can be taken. And then once that monitoring report is finalized, issue that to the grantee, generally within 30 days after the monitoring review. And then again, kind of as you're doing that monitoring report, you may get new documentation, you may get new correspondence, and make sure you're maintaining all of that within your monitoring file and documenting it in your monitoring file checklist. And then finally, the monitoring response, right? After you issue that monitoring report, there's often a back and forth between the provider and the monitoring entity in determining, were those findings grounded? Was there additional documentation that can be provided to show that, that issue was actually already being addressed, that finding or concern wasn't relevant? And having some back and forth on that. And then if kind of in the response, if findings are not adequately addressed, providing technical assistance to that grantee on how to resolve any open findings or concerns with that provider. If you don't get a response, if you're not able to kind of work through with your provider, at that point, you would be issuing a non-compliance letter to that subrecipient, to that provider, and requesting their response within a set time period. And that may become with more remediations to make sure that those findings are addressed. Once all findings have been cleared, at that point, you're drafting a clearance letter, or if the monitoring didn't result in any findings or concerns, the monitoring report itself would serve as the clearance letter. And that clearance letter is indicating the close of the monitoring cycle. And then finally, making sure that all of your your files, are updated with the documentation of the back and forth that comes with the monitoring response. And I think in the monitoring response, especially, it is really, really important to make sure that you are saving all of the correspondence that you have back and forth with the entity that you're monitoring. I think it is, easy to have oh, well, we did it this way, we did it that way, and you acknowledge, oh, okay, that works, or thank you, that's cleared. You want to make sure you're saving all that documentation. Or if you have a phone call to be talking through, any of the monitoring response and back and forth, make sure that you or someone on your team is taking good notes and then circulating those with the entity being monitored so that everybody is working from the same level of documentation, and you're saving all of that in your program file. So I know that's a lot. I think we're going to move into talking through eligibility, and then I think we'll open it up for questions. So Erica, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. Hopefully that was all helpful for folks. I know it's always helpful for me to hear Chris talk about monitoring because he is a wealth of knowledge, but we wanted to tease out a part of this presentation just to focus in on some key components around eligibility and some sticking points that we've seen when doing our own monitorings in other communities. Next slide, please. So you may be wondering, why are we talking about this? Like, what it really is the why behind this eligibility? to make sure that when you're working within ESGCV, but when I say that, no, you could apply this to any of your HUD funded programs. Ultimately, what you want to see in a client case file, and this could be, some folks still do paper files, it could be electronic, but it needs to be that backup justification, that story of all of the work that was done with the household. You first and foremost want to make sure that it is clear that the client that you spent any ESGCV money on was actually eligible for those services, that any of the costs that were involved were reasonable and in alignment with the eligible uses. And you also want to make sure that the housing is safe and adequate. And we're going to go into that in upcoming slides. But really the why behind all of those details would be that we're going to document that eligibility assistance. So that way there's no question that the folks who are receiving any help through this program were meant to receive that. That's called out, that we're serving that purpose. And really the primary goal behind that is to make sure that we are helping as many folks as we can through ESGCV because they met the criteria. You also want to make sure that it's documented what was used and that it's eligible. So that way the money can keep flowing. One, that you can get those invoices returned and there's not any question about like, wait, could we spend it on this or could we spend it on that? Did we really look into all the details we were supposed to? But also in the event that you've assisted a household and it was 2 years ago and it's hard to remember all of the details, that story lives in that case file. And then it's able to explain why you spent what you did. And then there will be reduce that question of like, are we going to have to repay these funds? So that's the key points for eligibility. It's making sure we're all clear, we're operating from the same playbook. Next slide, please. And speaking of playbook, written policies and procedures, these will be your friend. A lot of the time, this is something that gets put on the back burner for communities and also for programs like, yep, we've developed it. Or even if you've written it down and then you're in practice, realize, oh, actually, we do it this way. Just remember to circle back and have something documented that explains how your program flows. How do you actually screen folks? Like when someone comes in to you needing services, what is that intake process? How are you checking to make sure that folks meet the HUD homelessness definition of housing? Homelessness, sorry, or any of the other requirements that we're going to talk about soon. What's the process for your team to maintain that backup documentation? And when I say your team, also think of the folks that you fund directly. So some folks on this call might be operating programs, some of you may be doing the monitoring, but it's important to know what was the efforts made to verify certain details, and then making sure that anybody receiving that assistance from your program is documented. But what I also mean within that too is there might be folks who come to your program for assistance who are ineligible, who maybe don't meet all of that criteria. You still need to keep a copy of a case file and then document why this program wasn't going to work for them. So remember that. Sometimes it's easy to be like, oh no, that household didn't qualify. Let's keep copies as to why. And know that within those case files, within that story, what you're looking for is details that are specific to the individual or family, that it is very crystal clear how they've met that criteria, and that there's that backup documentation where needed to support that, and that the timeframes for any of that backup documentation coincide nicely for when they came to request assistance or when you do reevaluations, that we're looking at things that are fairly current. Next slide. So you heard me talk about like that initial intake or evaluation. This is kind of high level what's expected, regardless if you have emergency shelter all the way to rapid rehousing and everything else in between. What you're looking for that is that they're eligible for the assistance, that anything that you've spent, especially when they get permanently housed, that housing actually meets safety requirements that are needed there, and that the amount of assistance that you provide is what's needed to keep them stably housed. We want to make sure we're setting folks up for success. And then also, the only program, and I'm going to say this a couple of times, the only ESGCV component that requires some sort of income assessment at intake is homelessness prevention. So street outreach, shelter, rapid rehousing, there is no income requirements at program entry. And you're going to hear that over and over again from me. Also within like just moving into that initial evaluation, you're going to want to make sure your intake staff or anyone who's doing that, having that initial conversation is doing that consistent with what you've documented in those policies and procedures. And also that anytime that you're using coordinated entry, that you're doing this in sync with your continuum of care's coordinated entry policies. And then just a call out that there is some special provisions for our victim service providers, but make sure you're connected with your continuum of care to understand those details. Next slide. Great. And then reevaluations. So within homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing, we do reevaluations, and they're at different cadences. So homelessness prevention for ESG-CV only, that's every 6 months that you're working with a household. I recognize that there's a small portion of funds through California's ESG-CV program that's going through prevention. So we won't go into too much detail, but just know it's every 6 months. And then for rapid rehousing, we call it a reevaluation, but really it's just in the HUD terms, 12 months in is when you go into that more in-depth reevaluation conversation. And the purpose of that really is to learn what's changed within the household. Have resources shifted? Have circumstances changed? Have they reconnected with a network of folks who can help be like a part of their long-term stability? It's really that check-in piece to then determine, based off of what's currently going on in this household's life right now, what's the level of assistance that they need to be stably housed. So this is probably really small on your screens, and I apologize. You're all going to get a copy of these slides, and this might be a helpful matrix for you to have a copy to share with team members or others who are operating any sort of ESG-CV program. I'm not going to go into detail right now on homelessness eligibility and income because the remaining of our slides are really going to talk about that. But this is available here across components, so you can have kind of a cheat sheet of eligibility. What I wanted to talk about on this slide are the things that we're not going to go as deep on in this presentation. So first, our housing standards. I want to make sure that folks are aware that when it comes to monitoring, when it comes to case files and programs, that there are requirements to have documentation for housing standards. I'm going to put a link in the chat for you all to see. This link takes you to an overview of the habitability standards and a checklist that applies to both emergency shelter and that can apply to rapid rehousing or homelessness prevention. I think sometimes folks can forget that emergency shelters need to be verified for that habitability standard. So check out that checklist and that will help guide that process for you. But also know for any household receiving assistance, for rental assistance, that you have to check to make sure that the unit meets habitability or housing quality standards, also known as HQS. So within that, that means that if you're going to provide rent, you need to make sure that you're looking into this. And this is the option to pick habitability standards versus HQS is a flexibility within ESG-CV specifically. Annual ESG, the housing standards is habitability standards. And so know, like, you have that ability to choose, and then you probably know what I'm going to say, make sure that whatever standard that you're using is documented in your policies and procedures, that the people within the organization are trained in how to conduct those habitability standards or the housing quality standards, and whatever the final results are saved in the client file. And if the unit doesn't pass, that means that then you're not able to provide that financial assistance or rental assistance in that respect. The other thing to keep in mind is rent reasonableness, and this only applies to rapid rehousing programs and homelessness prevention. ESG-CV has actually waived the fair market rent requirement, and so you are able to just use rent reasonableness, which are the comparables of 3 similar units, to make sure that the rent being charged by the property owner or provider is consistent with what's going on within the market, that we're not getting price gouged because folks are connected to a subsidy. And that little sheet that has like the numbers and the analytics across, which that can just be a search online of similar units, that needs to be in the case file. It has to be in there regardless. And that's something I think that can be easily misplaced or lost. So please make sure that when you're checking in that folks are remembering both housing standards and rent reasonableness need to be connected into that file as long as you have it. And then lastly, I want to touch on a few things that come up just as we're doing this work, that questions come up around the role of having identification, be that when someone shows up for a program, do we need to require to see their driver's license, identification, a green card, something? And I want to make sure that folks on the call know that proof of citizenship is not required. That is something that I think comes up, and that can be a question that's happening, but you can serve folks without identification. And actually, if you are a nonprofit organization, you are not required by the federal government to look into that. And you also cannot be penalized if you choose to not verify identification. That is written down. HUD can't say, nope, you don't get any more money on this. That is up to you to decide. You can provide those benefits to folks. It just needs to be done consistently across the board. You can't pick and choose when you do that. So again, that's in your actual policies and procedures, that you're not, or it's not on your checklist to require a photocopy of a driver's license in a file, you'll be okay. If you choose to gather identification, which I would encourage you to not add any additional barriers as needed, because I know I lose my driver's license with alarming frequency, let alone folks who are on house. That it only really applies to your homelessness prevention funds. Then if you choose to do that, there is an act that is called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. And I'm going to throw into the chat kind of what HUD's put together as a fact sheet if you choose to go that route, so you know that information. All right, enough on that. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about the HUD homeless definition. I do though want to make sure on this slide, sorry, I'm not as fast with my own, that you all have a copy of this screenshot in front of you. So this screenshot and the link I put in the chat, click on that link and it's HUD's record keeping requirements. So I'm going to walk through this in the next few slides, but this is something to print it out, post it on a wall, save somewhere for your team and others to frequently refer to. Next slide, please. So in general, hopefully folks on this call know, but when we're talking about funding through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, we have 4 different categories within the definition of homelessness. Category 1, which is talking about folks who are literally experiencing homelessness. Category 2, which are individuals and families who are going to imminently lose their nighttime residence, and that's within 14 days. Category 3, which allows you to use it across other federal definitions, which I'll share information on, but others on the line, correct me if I'm wrong, to date, I don't know of any community that has approval to use category 3. So it's more than likely not relevant for your programs. And then category 4 are individuals and families who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, human trafficking, a lot of things that are covered within the VAWA Act. And within all of these things, when we're trying to determine how eligibility fits for homelessness and which category someone may or may not fit within, HUD does require some backup documentation to support that. And in the green box on your screen is their preferred order of documentation. And this goes across the board for the homelessness definition as well as income. And that would be first and foremost a third-party source to verify what's being said. And that could be written and oral. It's some sort of way that you can find out from someone like, yep, this is correct. The next would be intake observations through your team, and that's documenting case file notes to say that how this all works. And then lastly, which is absolutely an option if you can't find something for 1 and 2, would be self-certification. Sometimes folks call it an affidavit, but it's really the individual coming through youth services saying and verifying that the information that they're sharing is true. Next slide, please. So for category 1, what you're going to see here is on the far left-hand pane is the name of the category and what are the eligible uses specifically for ESGCB. Where could this fit within there for the programs that are being operated? The criteria, that's specifically HUD's definition for this category. And then the box on the right are the potential documentation standards that you would need. And so when you're monitoring, or if you're working with communities and they're serving somebody in a rapid rehousing program, for instance, and you need to verify that the household meets the criteria for literally homeless, category 1, that they either were staying someplace not fit for human habitation, perhaps that they were already in an emergency shelter or transitional housing program, or a nonprofit was covering their hotel motel, or they were exiting an institution for 90 days or less that they were in and previously had been met the definition of category 1. You'll see that there are the documentation standards, which could be a written observation by an outreach worker. That can cover within that, a written referral from another housing or service provider. You can also do certification by the individual or the head of household within this. And then it gets a little more specific when they're exiting that institution. You want to make sure you have that discharge paperwork for them, as well as some sort of verification of what their homelessness status was prior to entering the institution. Next slide. So category 2 is used most commonly within homelessness prevention. And I'm not going to go too deeply into all of this because I know, again, there's limited prevention funds, but just know that within the HUD definition of homelessness and category 2, it's that they're going to lose their residence within 14 days from when they come to you for assistance. They can't find anywhere else to live. They don't really have any other recourse in terms of being able to establish their own residence. And that network piece is huge, that they lack either being able to connect with family, friends, coworkers, someone who can help them through this, and other resources and supports when it comes to securing permanent housing. This is also a great time if your program is using diversion or housing problem solving to really have conversations and creative housing conversations with folks to avoid them entering into homelessness. I would say for your homeless prevention programs, you can use category 2, or there is a whole separate HUD definition of at risk of homelessness. We're not going to cover that today, but if you have any questions on that specifically, please feel free to reach out to your HCD grant specialist, and they will help you out with that piece. And so for documentation standards, the one thing I would say as it relates to prevention, and this sometimes trips people up, is it doesn't necessarily have to be a court-ordered legal eviction proceeding notice. There are other options that are available for folks to prove that they're going to have to lose they're going to lose their residence if they have a written lease. If they don't even have a written lease, there are other ways that you can document that. So keep that in mind. Next slide. This is category 3. Like I mentioned, I'm not going to go into the details for this, but in the event that at some point someone ever gets approved to use category 3 in their community, you have these resources here at your disposal. And so the final category we're going to talk about is category 4, which is on our next slide. And within that, that's when folks are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. Chris, if you wouldn't mind bumping us to the next slide, please. And that's when an individual or family is trying to get out of a situation that's definitely unsafe. And so you'll know within this circumstances that documenting this takes on a different meaning. You don't want to request information, a third-party verification that's going to put somebody at risk of continued harm. Also know that if someone is coming to you for rapid rehousing services, they can meet category 4, but they are also required to meet the definitions within category 1, which we talked about initially. So just know that those both have to go together for rapid rehousing. They only need to meet category 4 for shelter. And so there's also different documentation standards to know if you're a victim service provider versus if you're a non-victim service provider and someone comes to your program initially needing assistance. And so just know that for category 4, an oral statement by either the individual or the head of household is sufficient in this, and that saying that they are why they meet this categories or that they do meet this. And you can have a standard form with that language so everyone is providing that same level of information. You also can do some sort of self-certification statement by your intake worker and use a trauma-informed lens when you're talking about documentation for this. What is the most appropriate and least traumatizing for folks involved, but still meets eligibility. If you are not a victim service provider, it's definitely important to know that you can accept that oral statement by the individual or head of household, and then you do a certification by your own team. And just really remember, like at any point in this process, we are not trying to put people's lives in jeopardy for the sake of eligibility. So there are some different standards there to make it easier for folks to access services in a safe and humane way. Next slide. You heard me mention a little bit about prevention eligibility requirements. HUD allows for those who, the recipient, so in this case would be the state of California, who receives ESGCV funds, to establish their own parameters for how that fund can be best targeted in their community to serve those with the greatest need. And so the state of California has opted to include some criteria for how homelessness prevention can be used within those agencies that they fund. And so you'll see that they have made the annual income to be at 30% of area median income. ESGCV does allow it to go up to 50%, but we're going to do something targeted due to the needs in California, keep it at 30%. Folks still need to meet those requirements about insufficient resources or networks and supports. So when they come forward to you, but then also, so it's kind of a combination of category 2 and the at-risk of homeless definition, because folks will also need to identify one of these additional risk conditions to be eligible for your programs. And there's 7 of them here. And so I won't go into great detail about these, but again, if you have questions, reach out to your grant administrator from HCD and they can help clarify questions on this matter. Next slide. All right. We're not, so that was everything on the homeless definition. And for those of you still with me, thank you, because that is a lot of content. And now we're going to talk about income requirements, which really are only applicable to rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention, as you can see. So here's hopefully another handy table or matrix for your programs for folks to know what are the requirements. At no point does street outreach or emergency shelter require that you verify anybody's income. Of course, if you're doing housing focused case management, you're going to want to talk about what resources folks have to get rehoused. But from a HUD perspective, that's not an eligibility requirement there. Now, when we're doing rapid rehousing, I'm going to stress at program entry, income is not required. That is not something that you have to have. So if someone comes to your program and they have 0 income, please work with them, talk with them, get them connected to housing, all of those resources. We know that folks making 0 income can be very successful in a rapid rehousing program, and that's not a limitation. And then at that 1-year mark, the 12-month mark for ESGCV, what you're looking for is at that annual household income, is it equal to 50% of the area median income? And we have some resources and tools coming up in the upcoming slides that can help you figure out those details. And just know that what we're looking for here again is how has the household changed in the 12 months that they've been working with you? What's going on within there? And what's that right level of assistance for housing stability? The other thing I would just call out is similar to homelessness prevention and how HCD was able to put on different parameters. Continuums of care are also able to set different standards for rapid rehousing that are within the eligibility of HUDs. And so just be clear with your own continuum of care. What are the requirements for income eligibility for continued assistance? It should be in their written standards. Sometimes those are called performance standards. And it's always a worthwhile conversation to make sure we're all on the same page about the needs of the community. And then for homelessness prevention, I already talked about that really quickly, but it's 30% area median income at entry, as well as every 6 months that you provide assistance. Next slide. Great. So coming your way right now is currently the HUD's income calculator. And if we have time, I'm going to walk us through it. We may not have time today, though. And so the CPD income eligibility calculator, it does sometimes have a few bugs and a few quirks, but it's a great tool to use because it lets you determine you have to have a HUD exchange password, which you can set up, and then determine the funding source you're working with, and you could plug in relevant information about the household. Another nice thing about it, though, is if you need jogging for memory about different types of income and benefits and like how to solve it together, it has a really handy drop-down list, even for yourself. Just be like, oh yeah, we probably should be asking about veterans, hazard combat pay. Have you received that? Those sorts of things. This slide also gives you the specific rules and regs that you're going to want to look at when it comes to income, and that guides across federal programs. Next slide. So similar to documenting homelessness eligibility, documenting income has that same preferred order, which at first is written third-party documentation, followed by oral third-party documentation, and then self-declaration or that affidavit that can be supported by your case manager. And HUD's preference is always, if you can get third-party, go for it. And then if you can't get that, make sure that you have outlined in your policies and procedures and the folks doing the work are aware of what the due diligence is. So if you're not able for both the here and also I would say the homelessness definition, if you can't get third party, then you just need to make sure it's documented in your case files, the steps taken to try to achieve that, as well as how you're verifying it in a different way. Next slide. And then as you've heard me talk about for the area median income, which HUD evaluates on an annual basis, I'm going to put into the chat the actual AMI calculator. You can look at it based off of your metro, and it really is broken down by household size and how that fits within the area median income from 0 all the way to above 100% area median income. And you'll want to make sure that any household you're assisting, that you have a sense at that 12-month mark for rapid rehousing and at entry in 6 months for prevention, where do they fall on that scale? And that will also help to determine, like, how do we help you and provide you additional assistance if we need to increase your income or find other resources for you, perhaps to take on the challenges that you're experiencing with your grocery bill. Have we got you connected to CalFresh? Are you connected to CalWorks? Like, what are the things we can do in that respect? And just so we all know what HUD means when they say income, is that it's any money that goes to or on behalf of the head of household or the spouse to any other household member. So that's what we're talking about, is actual financial assistance. And that's your gross income for all the adult household members. So anybody 18 and over, that goes within there, and unearned income attributed to a minor. And so we're talking about that gross income before any deduction. So that total overall number. Next slide. And so when we're talking about determining eligibility, what you're going to look for within those files to make sure folks have been able to do, that they're documenting what that looks like. It's based on the time that they are requesting assistance or applying for assistance for ESG/CB. When we're talking at program entry, when you're talking at reevaluation, it's based on that 12-month mark for rapid rehousing, 6 months for homelessness prevention. And so if there's any sort of income that has recently been terminated, let's say they recently lost their job within the last 30 days, then you would not count that. And you want to make sure that your recertifications that you're doing is based off of what they're receiving at that specific time. And so you're going to want to look in that 30-day window, and that's how you pull together what's considered current. And your backup documentation should also be within that 30-day window. Next slide, please. And so when we come to this, and again, this is where that CPD calculator would be really helpful for folks. There's something called income inclusions, and that's what you do count. There's the exclusions that you don't consider, and that covers the income of all adult household members. And so what are inclusions? That's earned income. So if they have a job, and you can back that up with pay stubs, you can back that up with a bank statement that shows a direct deposit from their employer, those sorts of things. That's a W-2, that sort of thing. It also, though, covers if they are self-employed or have any business income coming in. If perhaps they don't have that, but maybe they have some investments and they're getting dividend income, that counts within the inclusions. Pension or retirement income falls within there. Any sort of armed forces income falls within there. Unemployment and disability income does. And if they received some of the pandemic unemployment assistance, which may be applicable to some cases because we know these are COVID funds. And also if they received the pandemic emergency unemployment assistance compensation, this was early on, like 2020, 2021, those count as the income inclusions. Also child support, alimony falls in here, TANF falls in here, public assistance, etc. The exclusions are for anybody who's getting income under the age of 18, if they got inheritance or the insurance, medical expense reimbursements, student financial aid, armed forces, hostile fire pay, and enhanced unemployment, like, it was called FPUC, but I did not write down what that's, the federal pandemic unemployment compensation. If they receive that funding, you don't count that within here. I know that was a lot of content, so I'm going to put in a couple of slides that may be helpful just to cover, because that's not everything and all of that on inclusions and exclusions. But here's a couple of sites that can probably be helpful, especially with that COVID related funding that came out. And I bring that up because I know we're doing monitoring for the life of the program. And so this may there might be circumstances where you see different income that we're not as familiar with right now because it was a one-time use of funds. Next slide. Okay, math is not my forte without a calculator, but here's a little bit of an example of what this would look like to determine income for a household. So you want to make sure this is annualized based off of what they've said they've reported. So you take in what they're getting on that monthly basis. What are they getting in? And if they have pay, you want to know, okay, are you getting paid weekly, monthly, annually? What does that look like? And you take that earnings and you multiply it by however many pay periods they have to figure that out. And so in this instance, let's say someone's making $525 for a 2-week pay period. And so, you know, based on the weeks of the year, that's 26 pay periods. So their annual income would be $13,650. And that would, then you would look up on that AMI calculator I showed you, or the matrix, and say, okay, they fall within this AMI bracket. And then also make sure that you're keeping that documentation in the file for their income of whatever that may be. It needs to be based off of 2, like when you're looking at that you're documenting based off the household side. So if it is a parent with a child, that's a household of 2. If it's just an individual, clearly it's a household of 1. And so things to think through in that respect. Next slide. And then you've heard me talk about this before, but just to remind folks that documentation you're looking for to support this, whether that be third party, oral that's verified by a third party, or self-certification, we're looking at a 30-day window prior to the application or the recertification process. There is an exception for your public benefits assistance. So you can look at a statement within the last 12 months. Just keep these things in mind, and that can be available there. So those are all of our fun income conversations. I'm sure that was, I know that was a lot of content. Don't worry, you're getting a copy of the slides. Chris, Andrews, I don't think we have time for the CPD calculator unless you disagree. I'm happy to walk through it if you think we have time.
Let's, I think Erica, give folks, there was one question that came in for you, and we'll give folks time to type in other questions. And then from there, we can judge if we have time to do a quick dive into the calculator. The question for you was if HMIS Green History is also third-party documentation.
Yes, I'm going to put in this HUD FAQ where they ask about HMIS specifically for third-party documentation. And so like if they've stayed recently in emergency shelter or safe haven, street outreach, you could put that within there. You could have the written observation within there of an outreach worker and others describing the household situation that they were living in. Written observation by a community member who's done this that they could put in there, or written referral by another housing provider. So hopefully that covers that. So if they're coming from another shelter, yes, that would count for sure.
Great. Folks who are with us, if you do have other questions, please go ahead, type them into the chat. And if we do have time, we'll hop over to the income calculator.
I think we lost folks, Chris. It was just such a fascinating presentation.
Right. Keith asks a monitoring question for total non-compliance. If you have examples of removing funding completely, that is actually something that I have been working with a provider on fairly recently, and it was something they actually, in getting the monitoring checklist, identified we had a misinterpretation of the program. It was their first time doing it, and you know, I don't know if we've been documenting things completely. And so that became an example of removing funding. I would recommend, Keith, I think, one, it's make sure you're operating within the terms of the agreement between the entity, where there often is a discussion of returning funding. But two, I think looking to see what can be done in a intermediate fashion. Are there opportunities for corrective action? Are there opportunities for kind of reducing grant size at first? Maybe operating with a smaller pot of funding becomes easier for compliance. So I do think there definitely can be examples of removing funds, but would always recommend not jumping to that nuclear action right away, and instead working with that provider to see if there are opportunities for correction. With that being said, if that is something you need to, by all means, that funding can be returned, and then you're just crediting kind of your account from an accounting perspective if need be. Josephine asks a question about match funding. I think one, it's really important to note match is waived for ESG CV. So match is not something that we are thinking about for the ESG CV program, but for your formula program that is not tied to having a COVID tieback, you do have the match requirement. And I think there are different ways to go about doing that. Some folks do, require match documentation right along with their reimbursement requests. Essentially, it's if that match is being paid by the grantee or by the subrecipient to that provider. Others do that as part of monitoring. And we'll do kind of an annual review of match, or if you're doing a 2-year term, do it as a 2-year term. So there are different ways to do that. I think the important, first part of your question is, do you monitor match funding? And yes, right. Understand, is that match an eligible activity? Is it eligible under 576? You want to make sure of that. You want to make sure that the match itself is eligible, that there's documentation for that match. One of the things, Erica may have other examples, one of the things I do kind of when starting with providers is understanding what are you doing for match? Are you doing cash or non-cash match up front? And then especially when it's non-cash match, working early to say, okay, how are you documenting? If you're doing volunteer hours, if you're doing something else, how are you documenting that? Because the last thing you want to do if you're a provider is say, well, yeah, we have 200 volunteer hours every month, all going into our program that is ESG eligible, but not having the right documentation for that. It's a really hard thing to go back and retroactively get. So I like to ask my providers, what are you doing for match? If you're doing non-cash, how are you documenting it? Do you need help documenting it? Can we put together a documentation standard for you, a checklist, a sign-in sheet, whatever it may be that you're using for your documentation, so you have that. But yes, you should be monitoring match. Any other questions that folks have? I know monitoring and documentation standards are one of those things that it feels really good until you're, then you're diving into it and into the details, and that can be when questions come up. I wonder, Erica, if you feel like you could do a quick review or even just flagging where the calculator is
Sure.
in 5 or 6 minutes.
Yeah, I can do
Let
that.
me stop sharing and you can take the screen.
Sounds good. All right, so you will see in front of you, I put this link in the chat. It's also hyperlinked in the slide. So when you get a copy of those, you just click on that link and it'll take you to the HUD Exchange. You'll have to log in. You can see that we're in my login. And what you do here is you would select the program that you're trying to come up with an income calculation for. So if you have different funding, know that that's available to you, but we're going to pick ESG because that's what we're on. And then you would hit start or new calculation. And you get to decide here what you're doing income calculation for. I'm going to pick rapid rehousing re-eval, but you can also use this if you have prevention funds. And it does make sure to call out that you, like right here, you got to give somebody a program number, so you could use their HMIS number. I'm just 1, 2, 3. That's what we're going to do. And then you tell them how many households are in there. And I'm going to do a single adult because it's a little easier. And so you create that here. And it pulls that up. And then I would give them their own benefit ID number. That's again, nothing personal. You don't put their name, that sort of thing. You give them a separate unique number there, and then indicate if they're the head of household, co-head. If you're working with families and someone's under the age of 18, they're a full-time student, it gives you ability to check for that. And sometimes this may just be helpful to jog our memories of all the things we're supposed to be keeping tabs of when calculating income. Here you get to select your state. So I'm going to pick California, and then it automatically should loan your different counties. And so I'm just going to scroll and let's pick Sierra County just because that came up. And you can choose here because we know for annual ESG, reevaluation for rapid rehousing is 30% AMI. For ESG CV, it's 50%. And so you can select 50% unless you've created a different program standards. And so this lets you know right away what the income limit is. If you are a single household living in Sierra County, that limit is 31.5 as of today. And then it very nicely says, please print this page for your files because they're getting you ready for monitoring, and you can hit click and print it or save it electronically. So that way there's verification that the household at that date meets this. And then you go through to benefit income. And nicely here, it kind of calls out some of the different categories: assets, anticipated income, so from employment, benefits, public assistance, or other. And you click these add buttons, and you're going to see a variety of things that you can pick for the household when you're having those conversations. So let's say this household had a retirement account, 401k, and let's say they currently have $15,000 in it. Oh sheesh, I shouldn't have picked actual income for assets because I don't know how to put that together quick. Chris, what do I put here? Do you remember, Chris Andrews? Maybe I should just pick cash. Do you remember?
I don't. I'd have to go back and look for asset documentation.
All right, well then we're gonna do it simple. We're gonna do cash. So that, and then for employment too, just know you click on here, you can put in the description of their job, if it's an hourly or annual salary, and if they have any bonuses. So let's say this person works at Starbucks and it's hourly, and I don't know what Starbucks makes, but they make $20 an hour. They're working 15 hours a week. And on average, they're working 40 weeks a year, let's say, just they don't get something every week. You can click here if they're going to get that annual cost of living adjustment, and it should annualize that for them. But this person will say no. And so then it populates in on estimate what that earned income is. For public benefits, you can select some of the other ones that they receive. I'm not going to put anything in there. Public assistance is the same. And then other, let's see what they let you do here. You could just pick if there's a category that doesn't fit nicely. And so at the end, after all of that, you hit calculate, and it should spit out an answer for you of like what would be all of their funding, anticipated annual income, what their benefits would be, public assistance, other income all together for their assets. And it gives you kind of a nice number for that total income, and then lets you see initially what that 50% limit would be. So you can quickly eyeball how that works, and you can save this and you can print it or save it in a file. But also know if you click to save and return to your dashboard, assuming there aren't any technical glitches, it would all be saved right here within your own HUD exchange. So you could go back and find that if in the event that you forgot to somehow migrate it to the client file. I would also say that you can save this and upload it to their HMIS case file so it lives there. So there could be different areas that you save this information.
So just wanted to share that as a useful tool for communities to have. And I'll stop sharing now.
Great, thank you, Erica.
Sorry, I couldn't remember how to do retirement, but that's okay. Somebody on the internet will be able to tell you how to do that.
So there is a great guidebook for the calculator. And we can send that link out as well. Seeing no other questions, thank you all for being with us. I know this is a lot of content. It's a lot of talking to you, talking at you on this, but thank you for staying with us. Thank you for your feedback. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for those who are sharing best practices. Those are great tips, great recommendations. And with that, Taylor, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Erica. That was a wonderful presentation on monitoring. Thank you all for attending this California HCD Community Workshop session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting, and Staffing Services Contract. Be sure to look out for more information on upcoming community workshops, as well as the slides and recording will be sent out to everyone on the call today. Additionally, a 3-minute survey will pop up at the end of this session. Please provide your feedback so we can be sure these training sessions are as useful as possible. Everyone stay cool out there in California today and have a wonderful day.